The red earth of Ouagadougou held memories like a burial ground holds bones. Captain Ibrahim Traore could feel them beneath his boots as he walked across the parade ground in the pre-dawn darkness, watching his soldiers prepare for what might be their last drill under his command. The air was thick with the dry harmattan wind that carried dust from the Sahara, coating everything in a fine layer of grit that seemed to represent the harsh realities of life in this landlocked nation. At 43, Traore had the weathered face of a man who had seen too much and the steady hands of someone who had learned to act despite uncertainty. His uniform bore the insignia of his rank, but more importantly, it bore the stains of honest work, the kind of service that couldn't be purchased with foreign currency or diplomatic pressure. When Lieutenant Sankara approached with the official summons at 0600 hours, the captain was standing in his office reviewing supply reports that told the story of a military stretched thin by budget constraints, while politicians drove luxury vehicles purchased with development aid. The document Lieutenant Sankara handed him bore an ornate seal, but its weight felt heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. "Constitutional Inquiry into Executive Conduct," he read aloud, his voice carrying the slight accent of his native Mossi language, even when speaking French. "Regional destabilization, abuse of military authority, actions prejudicial to state security." He set the paper down on his desk, which was scarred by years of use and covered with maps showing the locations of illegal mining operations he had been investigating. They finally decided to try this route. Lieutenant Sankara, barely 25 and still idealistic enough to believe in military honor, shifted uncomfortably. "Captain, sir, perhaps we should contact the Ministry of Defense, or—" "No, Sankara." Traore's interruption was gentle but firm, the voice of a leader who had made difficult decisions before. He stood from behind his desk, moving to the window that overlooked the compound where he had served for the past 5 years. Below, soldiers went about their morning routines, checking equipment, conducting briefings, maintaining the vehicles that barely ran on their inadequate maintenance budget. These were good men, honest men who had joined the military to serve their country, not to enrich themselves or to serve the interests of foreign corporations. For 18 months, Captain Traore had been systematically dismantling networks of corruption that reached from the gold mines in the east to the cotton fields in the west and all the way to the presidential palace in the center of Ouagadougou. His investigations had revealed how foreign mining companies paid bribes to officials who then allowed precious resources to flow out of the country in unmarked trucks, while schools lacked textbooks, hospitals lacked medicine, and farmers couldn't afford seeds for the next planting season. His sin wasn't just uncovering corruption. Many officials had been exposed before, sacrificed when the pressure became too great, replaced by equally corrupt successors. His real crime was connecting the dots, showing his fellow citizens how the seemingly separate problems they faced, poverty, unemployment, lack of opportunity, were all part of a larger system designed to extract wealth from Burkina Faso while keeping its people dependent on foreign aid and international loans with conditions that perpetuated their dependence. In his radio addresses, broadcast on stations that struggled to maintain their broadcasting licenses under constant government pressure, Traore had spoken in simple language about complex realities. "Brothers and sisters, we live on land that produces gold, yet our children go to school in buildings with holes in the roof. We grow cotton that becomes expensive clothes in Paris and London, yet our families wear second-hand imports. We have educated young people who migrate to Europe to work in restaurants, while foreign experts are paid enormous salaries to do jobs our own people could handle." These words had found fertile ground in a population tired of being told that their poverty was inevitable, their dependence necessary, their dreams unrealistic. University students had begun organizing discussion groups about economic sovereignty. Young professionals questioned why they needed to leave their homeland to find opportunities. Farmers asked why they couldn't process their own cotton, mine their own gold, educate their own children. The response from the established order was swift and escalating. First came the whispers, rumors about Traore's mental stability, suggestions that military life had made him paranoid, questions about his fitness for command. International news outlets, fed by unnamed sources, began running stories about his authoritarian tendencies and populist rhetoric. Think tanks in European and American capitals published policy papers warning about the dangers of military leaders who challenged established economic relationships in West Africa. When character assassination failed to silence him, they escalated to economic warfare. Bank accounts were frozen pending irregular transaction investigations that never concluded. Military supply contracts were subjected to review processes that stretched indefinitely. International conferences suddenly had no space for Burkina Faso representatives. Development aid was held up by procedural questions that multiplied like desert sand. The diplomatic isolation was perhaps the most effective weapon. Phone calls from foreign ambassadors expressing concern about regional stability, meetings with government ministers who explained with apparent regret that certain international relationships were too important to risk over one man's crusade, business leaders who spoke sadly about how political uncertainty was making it impossible to maintain operations that provided jobs for thousands of workers. The message was clear: support Traore and face consequences, oppose him and be rewarded. Stay silent and be left alone. But Traore had weathered it all with the same calm determination that had made him a respected military officer. He understood that his true crime wasn't constitutional overreach or regional disruption. His crime was hope. He had given his people something dangerous, the belief that they deserved better, and more dangerous still, the belief that better was possible. Now they were taking their final shot, a legal proceeding that would have the veneer of judicial propriety while serving the same function as a military coup. Remove the troublesome leader, but do it through courts and constitutional procedures so the international community could maintain the fiction that democratic institutions were functioning. "Sir," Lieutenant Sankara ventured, "what are your orders?" Traore smiled, the first time he had done so in weeks. "Prepare the men for inspection at 1400 hours. Make sure their uniforms are pressed and their equipment is clean. When this is over, they'll need to remember what it means to serve with dignity." The Supreme Court building of Burkina Faso stood like a colonial monument to justice deferred. Built during the French administration with imposing columns and arched windows designed to project authority, it had witnessed many important trials since independence, but never one where so much was at stake for so many people. By dawn on the day before the hearing, journalists from across West Africa had begun arriving. Vehicles with satellite dishes and broadcasting equipment lined the palm-shaded avenue. Local radio stations set up temporary studios in nearby buildings, their voices crackling through the dry Harmattan wind as they provided continuous coverage to a population hungry for information about what everyone sensed was a defining moment. International news crews worked with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to covering African political crises. They interviewed anyone willing to speak, asking questions that revealed their assumptions. Was this a legitimate legal proceeding against a military officer who had overstepped his authority, or was it a politically motivated prosecution designed to silence a voice of African nationalism? The answers they received often said more about the questioners than about the situation itself. Inside the court building, Chief Justice Amadou Konate stood in his chambers staring at a photograph on his desk. His grandson, Mamadou, barely 5 years old, smiled gap-toothed at the camera holding a toy airplane. The boy lived with his daughter Aminata in Abidjan, studying at a French-funded international school where he was learning to dream of becoming a pilot, an engineer, or perhaps a doctor, dreams that his grandfather's generation had been taught were unrealistic for African children. Justice Konate had worked for 35 years to create opportunities that didn't exist when he was young. Born in a village where the nearest school required a day's walk through bushland that was sometimes dangerous, he had studied by candlelight, saved money for years to buy textbooks, and worked multiple jobs to pay for law school in the capital. His rise through the judicial ranks had been slow but steady, built on a reputation for fairness, thoroughness, and incorruptibility that had made him respected even by those who disagreed with his rulings. He had presided over thousands of cases, land disputes between traditional chiefs and modern developers, commercial litigation involving foreign companies and local partners, criminal trials where justice struggled against corruption and political pressure. In 35 years, he had never been credibly accused of bias, bribery, or political favoritism. His colleagues respected him, lawyers trusted him, and even defendants who received harsh sentences generally acknowledged that they had been treated fairly. Now all of that hung in the balance. 4 days earlier, shortly after sunset prayers, he had received visitors at his modest home in a middle-class neighborhood of Ouagadougou. They hadn't announced themselves as representatives of any particular government or organization. They simply appeared. 3 impeccably dressed men who spoke French with slight accents that could have been from anywhere, who carried themselves with the quiet confidence of people accustomed to having their wishes respected. Justice Konate, the lead visitor had said, settling into the chair across from him in his small living room while his companions remained standing near the door. "You have built something admirable here. Your reputation for fairness is renowned throughout West Africa. Your family's success is truly inspiring." The justice had said nothing, waiting with the patience learned from decades of listening to arguments, testimony, and pleas. "The Traore situation presents complexities," the man continued. "We understand your position must be difficult, the pressure you must feel from various quarters. We simply want you to know that your dedication to true justice, not the theatrical kind, but real justice that serves larger purposes, would not go unnoticed or unrewarded." They had left 3 things: a briefcase containing more money than the justice made in 10 years, documentation for a full scholarship for his grandson at Cambridge University, and a very clear understanding of what would happen to his family if he chose unwisely. The scholarship was legitimate, a full ride at one of Europe's most prestigious universities, the kind of opportunity that could transform not just his grandson's life, but the trajectory of his entire family line. The boy was bright, curious, already showing the kind of intellectual promise that deserved every possible opportunity. And the threat, while never explicitly stated, was unmistakable in its implications. These were men who had the resources to make a 5-year-old boy disappear, to arrange fatal accidents for idealistic daughters, to ensure that families who chose poorly simply ceased to exist. Now standing in his chambers with the weight of 35 years of jurisprudence pressing down on him, Justice Konate felt the competing pulls of justice and family, principle and survival, the oath he had taken as a young lawyer and the responsibility he bore as a grandfather. His assistant knocked softly on the door. "Your Honor, Prosecutor General Ouedraogo has arrived for the preliminary briefing." Justice Konate straightened his robes and prepared to meet with the man who would argue for Captain Traore's immediate arrest and detention. Prosecutor General Marcel Ouedraogo had not slept properly in 6 weeks. A career civil servant who had built his reputation on meticulous preparation and unwavering ethical standards, found himself handling the most challenging case of his professional life while questioning everything he had believed about law, justice, and service to his country. The case file against Traore covered his desk like evidence of a crime he couldn't quite name. The documentation was extensive: financial records, military reports, transcripts of radio addresses, witness statements, surveillance photographs. But the more he studied it, the less convinced he became that it constituted grounds for the charges he was being asked to pursue. Ouedraogo had grown up in a family that revered education and public service. His father had been a school teacher who walked 12 kilometers each day to reach the village school where he taught children to read in both French and Moor. His mother had been a nurse at the regional hospital, working with inadequate supplies and impossible patient loads, because she believed that healing was a calling that transcended working conditions. They had sacrificed to send their son to university, where he studied law with the intention of protecting ordinary people against the powerful interests that seemed to control so much of African life. His first job had been as a public defender, representing farmers accused of theft when they couldn't prove ownership of land their families had worked for generations. His second position involved prosecuting corruption cases, going after local officials who embezzled funds meant for school construction or health clinic operations. He had built his career on the principle that the law should be a shield for the vulnerable and a sword against the corrupt. Now he was being asked to use it as a weapon against someone whose only apparent crime was taking those principles seriously. The evidence against Traore fell into several categories, each individually weak and collectively unconvincing to anyone approaching the case with genuine legal analysis rather than political objectives. First, there were the military operations that could be characterized as either legitimate anti-smuggling efforts or unauthorized deployments, depending on one's perspective. Traore had used his command to interdict trucks carrying gold out of the country without proper documentation. But such actions fell clearly within his authority as a military commander responsible for border security. Second, there were his public statements that could be seen as either patriotic calls for sovereignty or dangerous incitement to rebellion. But Ouedraogo had read the transcripts carefully, and while Traore's language was passionate, it contained no calls for violence, no threats against specific individuals, no advocacy for illegal action. If passionate speeches about national dignity were criminal, half the politicians in Africa would be in prison. Third, there were financial irregularities that suggested possible misuse of military funds. But closer examination revealed that Traore had actually been more careful with public money than most officials, maintaining detailed records and using resources exclusively for legitimate military purposes. The weakest part of the case involved allegations that Traore posed a threat to regional stability. But this charge was entirely based on reports from unnamed foreign sources who expressed concerns about his influence on military officers in neighboring countries. There was no evidence of actual destabilizing actions, only worry about potential future activities. Any competent defense attorney could create reasonable doubt about every significant allegation, and Ouedraogo had reviewed the file of Traore's court-appointed counsel, Fatimata Sawadogo. She was young but brilliant, a recent graduate of the University of Ouagadougou Law Faculty who had finished first in her class and already earned a reputation for thorough preparation and passionate advocacy. In a normal courtroom with normal political pressures, the case would likely fail, but this was not a normal case. Ouedraogo's phone rang constantly with calls from government officials, foreign diplomats, business leaders, and unnamed individuals who spoke with the authority of people accustomed to having their wishes respected. All expressed their concerns about regional stability and the importance of addressing the Traore problem through proper legal channels.
The subtext was always the same: failure was not acceptable. The pressure was both subtle and overwhelming. No one directly told him to fabricate evidence or ignore legal standards, but the message was clear that his career, his family's security, and his country's international relationships depended on achieving the desired outcome.
As he prepared for the preliminary meeting with Justice Konate, Ouedraogo reflected on the path that had brought him to this moment. He had joined the prosecutor's office to serve justice. But what was justice when it was being used as a tool of political control? He had sworn an oath to uphold the law without fear or favor, but what was the law when it was being manipulated to serve interests that had nothing to do with truth or fairness? The meeting with Justice Konate was formal and brief. Both men understood their roles in the larger drama, and neither felt comfortable discussing the obvious tensions. The charges were read, the procedures explained, the timeline established. But beneath the formal language, a deeper conversation was taking place about duty, pressure, and the price of integrity. The international community is watching this case closely, Ouedraogo said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone who understood that every conversation might be recorded. There are significant expectations about how this will proceed. Justice Konate nodded slowly, his expression revealing nothing. The law will be followed, prosecutor, regardless of expectations. Of course, Your Honor, I simply trust that you understand the complexities involved, the broader implications for our country's relationships and stability. I understand many things, prosecutor, including the oath I took 35 years ago when I first put on these robes. After Ouedraogo left, Justice Konate remained in his chambers staring out at the city where he had practiced law for more than 30 decades. Somewhere in those crowded streets, Captain Traore was preparing for what might be his final public appearance as a free man. Somewhere else, powerful people were finalizing their plans to ensure this proceeding reached the conclusion they had paid for. And somewhere in Abidjan, his grandson was learning to read in a classroom filled with other children whose futures hung in the balance of decisions their grandparents were making in courtrooms and government offices across Africa. Captain Ibrahim Traore spent the evening before his court appearance not in strategy sessions with lawyers or emergency meetings with supporters, but walking through the neighborhoods of Ouagadougou, where he had grown up, where his understanding of justice and dignity had been shaped by the daily realities of ordinary people trying to build decent lives under impossible circumstances. He moved quietly through the narrow streets as the sun set, past the small shops closing for the night, vendors selling cell phone cards, traditional medicines, soap, cooking oil, and the thousand small necessities of urban African life. Past the families gathered around their evening meals, sharing food that represented careful calculations about nutrition, cost, and availability. Past the children playing football with balls made from plastic bags and rubber bands, their laughter echoing off the compound walls in the gathering darkness. Few people recognized him without his military uniform or official entourage. He was just another middle-aged man in civilian clothes taking an evening walk, stopping occasionally to buy roasted ground nuts from a street vendor or to exchange greetings with an elderly neighbor. But those who did recognize him saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there during his public appearances. Not fear, but a deep sadness mixed with resolution. The neighborhoods had changed little since his childhood in the 1980s and 1990s. The same red earth streets that became dust clouds in the dry season and muddy streams during the rains. The same one-story buildings with corrugated metal roofs that collected water during the brief rainy season and radiated heat during the long dry months.
The same small businesses passed down through generations, struggling to survive on margins so thin that a single bad month could mean bankruptcy. But what had changed was the people's understanding of their place in the world, and their growing awareness that their poverty was not inevitable, their dependence not necessary, their dreams not unrealistic. The trial tomorrow wasn't just about him, Traore reflected as he walked past the mosque where he had learned to pray as a child. It was about whether a small African nation could chart its own course, or whether the old patterns of external control would reassert themselves under the guise of legal proceedings. It was about whether the ideas he had tried to plant, dignity, sovereignty, self-determination, could survive when confronted with the raw power of those who benefited from keeping Africa dependent. At the small mosque near his childhood home, he joined the Maghrib prayer, as he had done thousands of times before. The Imam, Abdul Parim, was a man who had known him since boyhood, who had taught him that true strength came not from weapons or authority, but from submission to principles greater than oneself. After prayers, as they walked together in the cooling evening air, the Imam spoke quietly. "Tomorrow will be difficult, Ibrahim." "Yes, uncle. Remember that strength is not in winning every battle, but in knowing which battles are worth fighting." Traore considered this wisdom as they walked past the small shops and family compounds of his childhood. "And how do you know which battles are worth fighting?" The old Imam smiled, his weathered face creasing with lines earned through decades of counseling people facing impossible choices. "The battles that aren't really about you, the battles that will continue even after you're gone."
That night, in his modest quarters, Traore wrote letters by hand, choosing his words carefully, because he understood that they might be his final communications to the people who mattered most to him. The first letter was to his wife, Salamata, a teacher at the local primary school who had supported his increasingly dangerous path, even when it meant facing harassment, surveillance, and threats against their family. "My beloved," he wrote, "if they take me tomorrow, remember that what we have built together, our love, our children, our commitment to living with dignity, cannot be arrested or imprisoned. Our children will grow up in a Burkina Faso where people understand that dignity is not negotiable, that sovereignty is possible, that ordinary people deserve extraordinary dreams." The letter spoke of his pride in her strength during the months when pressure had mounted against him, his gratitude for her willingness to share the burden of his choices, and his confidence that she would raise their children to understand that principles matter more than comfort, that justice is worth pursuing even when it's dangerous, that the future belongs to those brave enough to imagine it differently. The second letter was addressed to his officers, the men and women who had served under his command and who might face difficult choices in the coming days. "Brothers and sisters in arms," he wrote, "the uniform we wear represents service to something greater than ourselves, something that transcends any individual leader or political moment. Whether I am free or imprisoned tomorrow, that service continues. Whether I am praised or condemned by history, that service endures. Do not let anyone use my name or my fate to justify abandoning the principles that make military service honorable." He reminded them that their duty was to protect the people of Burkina Faso, not any particular government or leader.
He urged them to resist pressure to use military force against civilians, to maintain their integrity even when it was difficult, to remember that true soldiers serve justice rather than power. The longest letter was addressed to the young people who had seen in him a symbol of hope and change, who had attended his speeches and organized discussion groups about economic sovereignty and African dignity. "My young brothers and sisters," he wrote, "you have heard me speak about dignity and sovereignty, about the possibility that Burkina Faso could control its own destiny. These are not abstract concepts or political slogans. They are practical realities about how we live our lives, how we relate to each other, and how we engage with the world. Tomorrow they may arrest my body, but they cannot arrest these ideas unless you let them. The question is not whether I am free, but whether you will keep these ideas alive. The question is not whether they can silence me, but whether you will find your own voices. The question is not whether one man can change everything, but whether a generation can choose to live differently." He wrote about the importance of education, of economic development that served African interests, of political systems that reflected African values and priorities. He urged them to resist the temptation of cynicism, to believe in their own capacity to build something better, to understand that freedom was not something granted by others, but something claimed by those brave enough to demand it. As he sealed the letters and placed them in his desk drawer, Traore reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He thought about the gold mines where he had seen children working in dangerous conditions while foreign companies extracted millions of dollars worth of resources. He thought about the cotton fields where farmers worked from sunrise to sunset for wages that barely covered their families' basic needs, while international markets generated enormous profits from their labor. Most of all, he thought about the hope he had seen in young people's faces when he spoke about the possibility of change, the light in their eyes when they began to understand that their poverty was not inevitable, their dreams not unrealistic, their continent not cursed. That hope, he realized, was both his greatest achievement and his heaviest responsibility. Tomorrow would test whether that hope could survive when confronted with the harsh realities of power, whether ideas about dignity and sovereignty were strong enough to outlast the man who had articulated them. As he prepared for bed, Captain Ibrahim Traore felt a strange sense of peace. He had done what he could. The rest was in the hands of others. Judges and prosecutors, young people and old, ordinary citizens who would have to decide whether they were willing to pay the price that freedom always demanded. Outside his window, the city of Ouagadougou settled into sleep under a canopy of stars that had watched over this land for millennia, through empires and colonies, independence and dependence, hope and disappointment. Tomorrow would bring another test of whether the dream of African dignity could survive in a world that had powerful reasons for keeping that dream from becoming reality. The Supreme Court of Burkina Faso had never been the center of such intense international attention. By 4:30 in the morning, while the stars were still visible in the clear Harmattan sky, people had begun gathering outside the imposing colonial-era building with its distinctive arched windows and red tile roof that had witnessed so much history since independence. Street vendors appeared as if summoned by an invisible signal, setting up small stands to sell coffee, bread, and newspapers to the growing crowd. The early morning air carried the scent of wood smoke from cooking fires, the sound of transistor radios providing news updates, and the subdued conversations of people who understood they were witnessing something historically significant.
The crowd was remarkably diverse, representing a cross-section of Burkinabe society that rarely came together in one place. University students who had been inspired by Traore's speeches about African dignity and economic sovereignty stood alongside market women who had heard his radio addresses while selling vegetables and cloth. Government workers who had watched his anti-corruption efforts with interest mingled with farmers who had driven from distant villages to witness what they sensed was a defining moment for their country. International journalists worked with practiced efficiency, interviewing anyone willing to speak, asking questions that revealed their assumptions about African politics and democracy. Local television crews broadcast live updates every few minutes, their equipment powered by generators that filled the air with diesel fumes and mechanical noise. Radio stations across West Africa interrupted their regular programming to provide continuous coverage of what many were calling the most important legal proceeding in the region's recent history. The questions journalists asked and the answers people gave revealed the complexity of the moment and the different ways it could be understood. Was this a legitimate legal proceeding against a military officer who had exceeded his constitutional authority, or was it a politically motivated prosecution designed to silence a voice for African nationalism and economic independence? Was Captain Traore a dangerous, destabilizing force, as his critics claimed, or a symbol of hope for a continent tired of external control? Inside the courthouse, security was unprecedented and intrusive. Metal detectors that hadn't been used in years were hastily installed and operated by nervous security personnel who checked identification multiple times. Police officers with automatic weapons stood at intervals along the corridors. The usual casual, almost family-like atmosphere of the building had been replaced by a tense formality that made everyone speak in whispers. Court employees who had worked in the building for decades found themselves subjected to background checks and loyalty investigations. Maintenance staff were escorted by security guards as they performed their usual duties. Even the court reporters and clerks felt the weight of surveillance and the understanding that their every action was being monitored and evaluated. Justice Amadou Konat arrived at his chambers at 6 a.m., 3 hours before the scheduled proceedings, but he made no move to put on his robes or review his notes. Instead, he sat at his desk and opened a worn copy of the Constitution of Burkina Faso, the document he had sworn to uphold 35 years earlier when he first became a judge. Article 101, the judicial power is independent of the legislative and executive powers. Article 103, judges are independent in the exercise of their jurisdictional functions and are subject only to the law. Article 151, justice is rendered in the name of the people. The words that had once inspired him, that had guided his career and shaped his understanding of his role in society, now felt like a promise and a challenge. He had spent his entire professional life believing in these principles, building his reputation on them, teaching younger lawyers to respect them, and making decisions based on them, even when it was politically inconvenient or personally costly. His assistant knocked on the door, her voice betraying unusual nervousness. "Your Honor, there are some gentlemen here to see you. They say it's urgent." Justice Konat felt his blood run cold. He had hoped that his visitors from 4 days earlier would trust him to follow through on their implicit agreement that they would allow him the dignity of making his choice privately. Apparently, they had decided that too much was at stake to rely on his word alone.
Show them in." The same well-dressed men who had visited his home entered his chambers, but this time they carried no briefcases and made no offers. Their message was simpler and more direct, delivered with the quiet confidence of people who had never doubted the outcome of this proceeding. "Justice cannot," the lead visitor said, his voice carrying a slight accent that could have been French, Belgian, or perhaps South African. "We trust you understand the gravity of today's proceedings for everyone involved, for your family, for your country's relationships with important international partners, and for your own future." They left without another word, but their meaning was unmistakable. The choice was no longer between principle and reward, between justice and personal advancement. It was between compliance and consequences, between submission and the destruction of everything he had spent his life building. Alone in his chambers, Justice Connaught stared at his reflection in the window that overlooked the city where he had practiced law for more than 30 decades. The face looking back at him bore the lines of a man who had tried to serve justice faithfully, who had made difficult decisions based on law rather than politics, who had built a reputation for integrity that had made him respected, even by those who disagreed with his rulings. In a few hours, he would either destroy that reputation by bending to pressure, or he would risk everything he had built by standing for principles that suddenly seemed fragile and abstract in the face of real-world power. At precisely 8:30, Captain Ibrahim Traore's vehicle pulled up to the courthouse entrance. The crowd that had been murmuring and shuffling fell into complete silence, as if the very air had become too thick to carry sound. Even the journalists stopped their constant chatter. The moment everyone had been waiting for had finally arrived. Traore stepped out of the vehicle alone. No security detail, no legal advisors, no supporters or family members. He had insisted on arriving by himself, understanding that this moment would define not just his own fate, but the meaning of dignity and courage for everyone watching.
He wore his military uniform, but it was notably different from the ceremonial dress he had worn during public appearances. Instead of the formal dress uniform, with its decorations and insignia marking his rank and achievements, he wore the simple field fatigues of a working soldier, cleaned and pressed to military standards, but unpretentious and practical. The walk from his vehicle to the courthouse entrance took less than 3 minutes, but it felt like a march through history. Every step was photographed from multiple angles, recorded by television cameras, analyzed by commentators who would spend hours discussing the symbolism of his pace, his expression, his bearing. His expression remained calm and composed, neither defiant nor defeated. His pace was steady and measured, the walk of a man who had made his choice and was prepared to face the consequences. He acknowledged no one in the crowd specifically, but his presence seemed to acknowledge everyone: the students who had attended his speeches, the market women who had heard him on the radio, the ordinary citizens who had dared to hope that change was possible. The silence that greeted his arrival was not the silence of indifference or intimidation, but the silence of recognition that this moment would define not just one man's fate, but the meaning of justice, dignity, and sovereignty for an entire generation of Africans. Inside the courthouse, he was met by his court-appointed legal counsel, Fatimata Sawadogo, a young attorney who had volunteered for the assignment when more senior lawyers had declined the case or been pressured by their firms, their families, or their other clients to refuse. At 28, she was brilliant, idealistic, and honest enough to be frightened by the magnitude of what she had undertaken. "Captain," she said, her voice betraying nervousness despite her efforts to project confidence,
We should discuss strategy one final time. The prosecutor will almost certainly move for immediate detention. We need to be prepared with our response." Traore studied her face, earnest, intelligent, brave in the way that young people could be brave before they fully understood the costs of courage. "Counselor, what do you honestly think our chances are?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully, weighing her professional obligation to provide honest counsel against her human desire to offer hope. Legally, the charges are weak. The evidence is almost entirely circumstantial. The constitutional questions are complex, but favor the defense. In a fair proceeding conducted according to established legal standards, the charges would likely be dismissed or result in acquittal. And in an unfair proceeding, Traore prompted gently. She looked down at her legal briefs, unable to meet his eyes. In an unfair proceeding, the outcome has already been decided. "It's all right, Counselor," Traore said gently, his voice carrying the warmth of a father speaking to a daughter. "You've already shown more courage than most by being here, by taking this case, by standing up when others chose to sit down. Whatever happens today, you've honored your profession and your oath." Her eyes brightened slightly at his words, and she stood a little straighter. This was exactly why she had become a lawyer, to stand for something meaningful, to defend principles even when it was difficult and dangerous, to be part of a system that could potentially produce justice even under enormous pressure. "Captain," she said, her voice growing stronger, "whatever they do to you, they cannot diminish what you have accomplished. You have given people hope, and hope is harder to kill than any individual." Traore smiled, a genuine expression of warmth that transformed his weathered features. "That, Counselor, is exactly what I needed to hear." Courtroom 1 of the Supreme Court building had been transformed into something resembling a theatrical stage, more than a venue for judicial proceedings. Additional seating had been installed to accommodate the unprecedented number of observers, but the arrangement seemed designed more for dramatic effect than for practical needs for legal proceedings. In the front rows, reserved for official observers, sat an impressive array of international diplomats. The French ambassador, impeccably dressed and maintaining an expression of diplomatic neutrality that barely concealed his intense interest in the proceedings. Representatives from the European Union, the African Union, and various international organizations whose presence sent clear signals about the global importance of this local legal matter. Behind them sat foreign correspondents from major international news organizations, BBC, France 24, CNN International, Deutsche Welle, alongside journalists from across West Africa who understood that this story would resonate far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Local officials occupied another section, their presence both supporting the proceedings' legitimacy and demonstrating the government's confidence in the outcome. Ministers, deputy ministers, and senior civil servants who had rarely shown interest in judicial proceedings now filled the courtroom, their attendance sending its own message about the political importance of the case. Near the front, in the section reserved for family members, sat Traore's wife, Salamata. She wore traditional dress in the colors of the Burkina flag, red for the revolutionary past, white for the peace they hoped to achieve, green for the hope of abundance. Her presence was quiet but powerful, a reminder that behind the political drama was a family whose life would be forever changed by the day's proceedings. Their two children, aged 12 and 15, sat beside her with the confused dignity of young people trying to understand why their father had become the center of such controversy. They had grown up hearing him speak about justice and sovereignty at the dinner table, but they were only now beginning to understand the price that such principles could demand. The court clerk, Miriam Ouedraogo, a woman who had worked in the building for 22 years, called for order as Justice Konate prepared to enter the courtroom. She had seen many important cases, but never one where the very foundations of the legal system seemed to be at stake, where the outcome would determine whether courts serve justice or power. Justice Amadou Konate paused outside the courtroom door, his hand resting on the handle that he had grasped thousands of times during his career. Through the thick wood, he could hear the subdued murmur of conversation, the rustle of papers being arranged, the scraping of chairs as people settled into position for the drama about to unfold. In a few moments, he would walk into that room and take his place at the bench where he had presided over countless cases during his 35-year career. He had ruled on contract disputes, land conflicts, criminal prosecutions, constitutional questions, always striving to base his decisions on law rather than politics, evidence rather than pressure, justice rather than convenience. But none of those cases had prepared him for this moment, when the choice was not between competing legal interpretations, but between submission and resistance, between personal survival and professional integrity, between the safety of his family and the principles he had sworn to uphold. He thought of his grandson Mamadou, probably having breakfast at this very moment in Abidjan, preparing for another day at the international school where he was learning to dream big dreams. The boy was bright, curious, already showing signs of the intellectual promise that deserved every possible opportunity. The scholarship to Cambridge University would guarantee him a future that transcended the limitations of his grandfather's generation. He thought of the briefcase hidden in his home, containing more money than he had ever imagined possessing, enough to secure his family's future for generations, enough to buy comfortable retirement, enough to ensure that his daughter Aminata would never struggle financially as he had done. He thought of the subtle threats delivered with the calm professionalism of people who made their living managing the consequences of disobedience. His family's safety hung in the balance of his decision, and these were people with the resources and connections to make threats into realities. And he thought of the oath he had taken as a young man, full of idealism about law and justice, the promise to uphold the Constitution without fear or favor, the commitment to serve truth rather than power, the belief that courts could be sanctuaries where right mattered more than might. The door opened, and he stepped into the courtroom. "All rise for the Honorable Justice Amadou Konate." The familiar ritual words echoed through the packed courtroom as Justice Konate took his place at the bench. Everyone stood, diplomats and journalists, officials and observers, supporters and opponents, united for a moment in respect for the formal procedures that gave legitimacy to whatever was about to unfold. The formal ritual of court proceedings began with its ancient cadences, the reading of the case number, the identification of the parties, the statement of charges that would determine one man's fate and potentially shape a nation's future. The state of Burkina Faso versus Captain Ibrahim Traore, case number SC 2024-0847, announced the clerk. Charges of constitutional overreach, abuse of military authority, actions prejudicial to state security, and threatening regional stability. But everyone present understood that what was really beginning was a test of whether the rule of law could survive when it conflicted with the rule of power, whether judicial independence was real or merely ceremonial, whether African dignity was a practical possibility or just a beautiful dream. Prosecutor General Marcel Ouedraogo rose to present the state's case with the bearing of a man who had spent weeks preparing for this moment, while questioning everything he believed about law and justice. His voice was steady and professional, betraying none of the inner turmoil that had kept him awake for weeks, none of the doubt that had grown stronger with each day of preparation. "Your Honor," Ouedraogo began, his words carrying the weight of both legal authority and political necessity. "The evidence will show that the defendant, Captain Ibrahim Traore, has consistently and deliberately exceeded his legitimate authority as a military officer, undertaken actions that destabilize our nation's democratic institutions, and posed a clear and present danger to the constitutional order of Burkina Faso and the stability of the West African region." As he spoke, outlining the prosecution's case with the practiced precision of a career prosecutor, Traore sat motionless at the defendant's table. His posture was erect but relaxed, his hands folded calmly in front of him, his expression attentive but revealing nothing of his inner thoughts. His presence seemed to fill the courtroom without dominating it, commanding respect without demanding attention. The case Ouedraogo presented was carefully constructed to sound compelling while avoiding the kind of specific allegations that could be definitively disproven. Yes, much of the evidence was circumstantial. Yes, many of Traore's actions could be interpreted as legitimate exercises of military authority, but taken together, the prosecutor argued, they formed a pattern of behavior that threatened the very foundations of democratic governance. The defendant, Ouedraogo continued, moving to an easel where charts and photographs had been arranged to support his argument, systematically used his military position to interfere in civilian governance, conducting operations that exceeded his authority and making public statements designed to undermine confidence in democratically elected leadership. He presented photographs of military convoys that had interdicted smuggling operations, characterizing them as unauthorized deployments that violated the separation between military and civilian authority. He played recordings of Traore's radio addresses, editing them to emphasize the most forceful language while removing the broader context that made clear his commitment to constitutional processes. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Ouedraogo said, his voice gaining strength as he moved through the carefully rehearsed presentation, "intelligence reports from multiple sources indicate that the defendant's actions have inspired similar movements in neighboring countries, threatening the stability of the entire West African region. His rhetoric about sovereignty and self-determination has been adopted by groups seeking to destabilize legitimate governments across the region." The intelligence reports he referenced were classified documents that couldn't be examined by the defense, provided by unnamed sources whose credibility couldn't be challenged, describing threats that were vague enough to be impossible to disprove. It was the kind of evidence that would never stand up to serious scrutiny, but sounded impressive in a courtroom where political considerations outweighed legal standards. "Most critically," Ouedraogo concluded, his voice carrying the gravity of his final argument, "the state has compelling reason to believe that the defendant may attempt to flee the jurisdiction or interfere with ongoing investigations. His network of supporters, his access to military resources, and his demonstrated willingness to operate outside normal channels make him an unacceptable flight risk. Therefore, we respectfully request that this court order his immediate detention pending a full trial on these serious charges." This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The request for immediate arrest that would remove Traore from public life and send a clear message about the consequences of challenging established power structures. The legal maneuver was straightforward, but its political implications were enormous. In the gallery, journalists leaned forward, their cameras focused on the defendant's table, where Traore continued to sit with the same calm dignity he had maintained throughout the proceeding. International observers made notes that would become the basis for reports sent to capitals across the globe. Local officials watched with the satisfaction of people who had invested heavily in ensuring a particular outcome. Attorney Fatimata Sawadadogo rose to respond, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged her papers on the podium. At 28, she was about to deliver the most important argument of her young career in front of more observers than she had ever addressed, defending a client whose fate had already been decided by forces far more powerful than legal precedent or constitutional principle. "Your Honor," she began, her voice gaining strength as she found her rhythm. "The prosecution's case is built on speculation, political grievance, and the systematic mischaracterization of lawful military actions undertaken by a dedicated officer in service to his country. Captain Traore has served Burkina Faso with distinction for over 15 years, and his record shows not abuse of authority, but unwavering dedication to the principles of sovereignty, transparency, and anti-corruption that every citizen of this nation should support." She moved through the charges methodically, demonstrating with careful legal analysis how each could be explained as a legitimate exercise of military authority within established chains of command. The operations the prosecution characterized as destabilizing, she argued, were efforts to combat smuggling networks that were draining the country's resources and undermining its economic sovereignty. The speeches they called inflammatory were calls for national dignity and self-determination that fell well within the bounds of protected political expression. The prosecution speaks of regional destabilization, but they offer no evidence of specific destabilizing actions, only vague references to classified intelligence that cannot be examined or challenged. They speak of constitutional overreach, but they cannot cite a single specific violation of military regulations or legal authority. They speak of threats to democracy, but Captain Traore's record shows consistent respect for civilian authority and constitutional processes. Her argument was legally sound, passionately delivered, and thoroughly researched. She had spent weeks preparing every point, anticipating every counterargument, building the kind of comprehensive defense that would normally create reasonable doubt about such serious charges. "Most importantly, Your Honor," she concluded, her voice carrying the gravity of her final argument, "Captain Traore has voluntarily appeared before this court. He has not fled, he has not resisted, he has not used his position or his supporters to evade legal proceedings. He has submitted himself to the judicial process as is proper for any citizen, regardless of rank or position. The prosecution's request for immediate detention is premature, unnecessary, and contrary to the presumption of innocence that is fundamental to our legal system and our Constitution." Her argument was everything it should have been, well-researched, legally grounded, and delivered with a kind of passion that made clear she understood the stakes involved. In a normal courtroom, under normal circumstances, with normal political pressures, it might have been enough to prevent immediate detention and ensure a fair trial on the merits. But as she returned to her seat, everyone in the room understood that this was not a normal courtroom. These were not normal circumstances, and the pressures involved had nothing to do with normal legal considerations. Justice Konate called for a brief recess to consider the prosecution's request for immediate detention. As the courtroom emptied for the 15-minute break, he remained at the bench, staring down at the legal briefs before him without really seeing the words written on the pages. The law was absolutely clear. Without compelling evidence of flight risk or immediate danger to the community, pre-trial detention was inappropriate and potentially unconstitutional. The prosecution's case, while politically motivated and well-orchestrated, was legally weak and would likely fail if subjected to normal judicial scrutiny. A fair application of established judicial standards would deny the request for immediate detention and allow Captain Traore to remain free pending a full trial where the evidence could be properly examined and the constitutional questions could be thoroughly explored. But fairness, Justice Konate now understood with painful clarity, was not the standard by which this case would be judged. The outcome had been purchased with briefcases full of foreign currency, guaranteed with threats against innocent family members, and orchestrated by forces that had never doubted their ability to control African legal systems when their interests were at stake. The 15-minute recess stretched into 25 minutes as Justice Konate remained alone at the bench, staring at documents he had read a dozen times while wrestling with the most difficult decision of his professional life. In the galleries behind him, observers grew restless, journalists checked their equipment, and the well-dressed men at the back of the courtroom maintained their patient confidence. Through the tall windows of the courtroom, he could see the crowd that had gathered outside. Hundreds of people who had come to witness what they understood was a defining moment for their country. Students from the university, market women who had closed their stalls to attend, farmers who had traveled from distant villages, ordinary citizens who sensed that something important was happening even if they couldn't fully articulate what it meant. When Justice Konate finally called for order and the courtroom refilled, the tension was almost palpable. Everyone understood that the next few minutes would determine not just Captain Traore's immediate fate, but the meaning of judicial independence in Burkina Faso for generations to come. This court has carefully considered the prosecution's request for pre-trial detention, Justice Konate began, his voice carrying the weight of 35 years of judicial experience and the knowledge that his next words would define his legacy. The decision is not one to be made lightly, as it involves fundamental questions about constitutional rights, the presumption of innocence, and the proper balance between state security concerns and individual liberty. In the defendant's section, Captain Traore sat with the same calm dignity he had maintained throughout the proceedings. His wife Salamata leaned slightly forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her children watched their father with the kind of intense attention that comes when young people begin to understand that the adult world is more complex and dangerous than they had imagined. The prosecution has presented what it characterizes as compelling evidence of flight risk and potential interference with ongoing investigations, Justice Konate continued, each word carefully chosen and weighted with meaning. The defense has argued with considerable legal merit that such concerns are speculative and that the defendant's voluntary appearance and cooperation demonstrate his commitment to participating in the legal process. Prosecutor Ouedraogo sat motionless, his expression revealing nothing of the enormous pressure he felt to achieve the predetermined outcome. Defense attorney Ouedraogo gripped her pen so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, understanding that her client's freedom and possibly his life hung in the balance of the judge's next words. At the back of the courtroom, the well-dressed men watched with the patience of people who had never doubted the return on their investment. They had purchased this outcome with money, threats, and the kind of systematic pressure that had proven effective in courtrooms across Africa when African dignity conflicted with external interests. Justice Konate looked directly at Captain Traore, and for a moment the two men's eyes met across the formal space of the courtroom. In that brief exchange, something passed between them. An acknowledgement of the courage required to stand for principles when the cost was personal, a recognition of the burden carried by those who choose to serve something greater than their own immediate interests. This court has carefully considered the prosecution's request for pre-trial detention, Justice Konate said, his voice growing stronger with each word. The following presented as compelling evidence of flight risk or immediate danger to the community. The defense has argued with considerable legal merit that such concerns are speculative and that the defendant's voluntary appearance and cooperation demonstrate his commitment to participating in the legal process. A murmur ran through the courtroom as people began to understand what they were hearing. This was not the rubber stamp approval of detention that everyone had expected. This was a judge actually applying legal standards rather than political pressure. Furthermore, Justice Konate continued, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who had remembered why he had become a judge in the first place. The charges presented, while serious, are largely based on interpretations of actions that could equally be characterized as legitimate exercises of military authority. The constitutional questions involved are complex and deserve thorough examination in a full trial, not summary judgment based on political considerations.
The well-dressed men at the back of the courtroom exchanged glances for the first time, their confidence beginning to show cracks. This was not proceeding according to their carefully laid plans. Therefore, Justice Konate announced, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom like a bell tolling for justice. The prosecution's request for immediate detention is denied. The defendant will remain free pending trial, which will be scheduled within 60 days to ensure his right to speedy adjudication of these charges. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Supporters in the gallery cheered and applauded, while government officials looked stunned. International journalists scrambled to report this unexpected development. The well-dressed men at the back stood abruptly and left the courtroom, already reaching for their phones to report this failure to their superiors. Captain Traore remained seated, his expression unchanged, but his wife, Salamata, covered her face with her hands and wept with relief. Their children looked confused but hopeful, beginning to understand that their father would be coming home that night. Defense attorney Swawadogo stood and smiled, the first genuine smile she had managed in weeks of preparation. She had argued her case believing it was hopeless, but legal principles had somehow prevailed over political pressure. Prosecutor Ouedraogo sat in stunned silence, understanding that his career would never recover from this unexpected defeat, that he had failed to deliver the outcome that powerful interests had purchased and demanded. But the victory celebration was premature. As Justice Konate gathered his papers and prepared to leave the bench, 3 men in dark suits entered the courtroom through a side door that was normally used only for security. They moved with the purposeful efficiency of people carrying out orders, their presence immediately changing the atmosphere in the room. The lead man, wearing the insignia of a senior security official, approached the bench and handed Justice Konate an official document. "Your Honor," he said, in a voice that carried clearly through the courtroom, "I have here a warrant issued under the National Security Act for the immediate detention of Ibrahim Traore, pending investigation of charges related to threats against state security." Justice Konate stared at the document, understanding immediately what was happening. When the judicial system had failed to deliver the desired outcome, they had simply bypassed it, using security legislation that allowed detention without normal legal protections or judicial oversight. "This warrant supersedes any previous judicial rulings," the security official continued, his words chosen to sound respectful while making clear that the court's authority was being nullified. "The defendant must be taken into custody immediately." Captain Traore stood slowly, his movements deliberate and dignified. He had expected this moment, had prepared himself for it, understood that powerful interests would not allow a single African judge to derail their carefully orchestrated plan. "Wait," Justice Konate said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "This court is still in session, and I have not dismissed the defendant. Any attempt to arrest him during judicial proceedings would constitute contempt of court and interference with judicial authority." The security official looked uncomfortable but determined. "Your Honor, I respect the court, but I have direct orders from the highest levels of government. This is a matter of national security that transcends normal judicial procedures." For a moment that felt like an eternity, the courtroom was completely silent. 2 systems of authority,
judicial and security, legal and political, faced each other across the formal space of the courtroom while hundreds of observers held their breath. Justice Konate stood slowly, his judicial robes making him seem larger than his actual physical stature. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of 35 years on the bench and the weight of principles that had guided his entire career. "Officers," he said, addressing the security men directly, "I am ordering you to stand down. This court is in session. The defendant is under judicial protection, and any interference with these proceedings will be considered a violation of the Constitution of Burkina Faso and an assault on the independence of the judiciary." The lead security official hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but equally clearly under pressure to complete his mission. "Your Honor, I respect the court, but I have direct orders from the highest levels of government. This is a matter of national security that transcends normal judicial procedures." Justice Konate moved from behind the bench, walking down to stand between the security officers and Captain Traore. The symbolism was unmistakable, a judge placing himself physically between the forces of arbitrary power and a defendant under judicial protection. "No," Justice Konate said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "There is no authority higher than the Constitution, no security more important than the rule of law, no order more legitimate than the principles of justice that this courtroom represents." The confrontation was being broadcast live across West Africa and around the world. In capitals from Paris to Washington to Beijing, officials watched in real time as an African judge made a stand that would define the meaning of judicial independence for a generation. Captain Traore stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Justice Konate's shoulder. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "you have already done more than anyone could ask. You have shown that justice is possible, that principles matter, that courage exists. Don't sacrifice yourself for my sake." Justice Konate turned to look at him, and in that moment both men understood what was really at stake. This was not just about one captain, or one case, or even one country. This was about whether African dignity was real or just a slogan, whether justice was possible or just a dream, whether courage could overcome power when the stakes were highest. "Captain," Justice Konate said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom, 35 years ago, I took an oath to uphold justice without fear or favor. Today, for the first time in my career, I understand what that oath really means." He turned back to face the security officers, who had been joined by additional personnel carrying handcuffs and restraints. "I am formally ordering you to leave this courtroom. The defendant is under judicial protection, and I will not allow that protection to be violated while I have breath in my body." What happened next would be remembered and retold across Africa for generations. The lead security official, clearly uncomfortable but following orders, nodded to his men and stepped toward Justice Konate. "Your Honor, I'm sorry, but we have to proceed." Justice Konate raised his hand, the same hand that had signed thousands of judgments, that had sworn countless oaths, that had spent decades pointing toward justice, and said in a voice that carried the authority of law itself, "Stop!" The single word echoed through the courtroom with such power that the security officers actually paused, uncertain how to proceed against a judge who refused to yield to their authority. In that moment of hesitation, something extraordinary happened. One by one, people in the courtroom began to stand. First, the university students, then the market women, Then the farmers who had traveled from distant villages. Within moments, hundreds of observers were on their feet, not cheering or chanting, but simply standing in silent solidarity with the judge who had chosen principle over safety. The security officers found themselves facing not just one defiant judge, but an entire courtroom full of citizens who had chosen to stand with justice against power. The symbolism was overwhelming. Ordinary Africans finally saying that they would not accept the subversion of their institutions, the corruption of their courts, the defeat of their dreams. For several minutes, the standoff continued. Security forces facing a judge and his supporters, power confronting principle, the old order meeting a new assertion of African dignity. Finally, the lead security official spoke into his radio, reporting the situation to his superiors and requesting instructions on how to proceed. The response, when it came, was swift and decisive. All units stand down. Repeat, all units stand down and withdraw from the courthouse. The security officers left as quickly as they had arrived, understanding that the cost of forcing a confrontation in front of international media was too high, that the image of African security forces dragging an African judge from his own courtroom would do more damage than allowing one captain to remain free. Justice Konate remained standing until the last officer had left the courtroom. Then he turned to face Captain Traore, who was still standing quietly at the defendant's table. "Captain," Justice Konate said, his voice carrying both exhaustion and triumph, "this court stands adjourned. You are free to go." The Ouagadougou trial ended not with a verdict but with a victory, not for any individual, but for the idea that justice could still prevail when people chose to stand for it. The image of Justice Konate facing down security forces, backed by a courtroom full of ordinary citizens, became an icon of African judicial courage that inspired similar stands across the continent. Within days, judges in Ghana, Senegal, and Nigeria cited the Ouagadougou standard when refusing to bow to political pressure in high-profile cases. Law students across Africa organized demonstrations supporting judicial independence. International legal organizations held up Justice Konate's courage as an example of what judicial independence could mean when judges remembered their oath to serve justice rather than power. Captain Traore used his freedom to establish the Center for African Dignity, an organization dedicated to educating young people about economic sovereignty and self-determination. His near arrest became a rallying point for a new generation of African leaders who understood that true independence required not just political freedom, but economic autonomy and judicial integrity. The well-dressed men who had orchestrated the campaign against Traore eventually succeeded in having him transferred to a diplomatic posting far from Burkina Faso. But their larger objective had failed. The ideas he represented, African dignity, economic sovereignty, resistance to external control, had taken root too deeply to be easily uprooted by the removal of one man. Justice Konate continued to serve on the Supreme Court, but his grandson never got the scholarship to Cambridge University, and his family never saw the money that had been offered. Instead, Young Mamadou grew up hearing stories about his grandfather, who chose justice over comfort, principle over safety, courage over compliance. He learned to be proud of a family legacy built on integrity rather than wealth. Years later, when historians wrote about the turning point in Africa's struggle for genuine independence, many pointed to a morning in Ouagadougou when an ordinary judge remembered his oath, when a soldier chose principle over freedom, when ordinary citizens stood up and said enough to forces that had controlled their continent for too long.
The story became more than a news event or a legal precedent. It became a reminder that in the darkest moments, when power seems absolute and resistance seems futile, ordinary people can still choose to stand for something greater than themselves. And sometimes, when enough people make that choice, everything changes. The legacy of the Ouagadougou trial lived on in courtrooms, where judges chose justice over expedience, in schools where children learned that dignity was not negotiable, in communities where people understood that their poverty was not inevitable and their dreams were not unrealistic. Captain Ibrahim Traore had wanted to give his people hope. Justice Amadou Konaté had wanted to preserve the rule of law. Neither man achieved everything he set out to accomplish, but together they created something more powerful than individual victory. They demonstrated that African dignity was not just an aspiration, but a practical possibility, worth fighting for and capable of prevailing when people chose courage over comfort. The well-dressed men returned to their capitals to report a tactical success. One troublesome captain had been neutralized, but they had lost something far more important: the illusion that African courts, African judges, and African people would always yield to external pressure when the stakes were high enough. That illusion, once broken, could never be fully restored. And in its absence, a new generation of Africans began to believe that justice, dignity, and true independence were not just dreams, but achievable realities worth any sacrifice necessary to secure them. The Ouagadougou trial ended, but the fight for African dignity continued. In courtrooms and classrooms, in parliament buildings and village squares, wherever people chose to stand for principle against power, wherever ordinary citizens decided that their children deserved a future built on justice rather than compromise. The story of that day in Ouagadougou became a testament to the truth that Justice Konaté had discovered in his moment of decision: that integrity is not about being perfect, but about choosing principle when the cost is highest, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something matters more than safety, and that justice is not a guarantee, but a possibility that must be fought for each generation by people willing to risk everything to preserve it. In the end, they had tried to stage a trial that would demonstrate the futility of resistance to established power. Instead, they had created a moment that proved exactly the opposite: that justice was possible, that dignity was real, and that African courts could serve African people when African judges remembered why they had chosen to serve justice in the first place.